Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. Today, this subcommittee is holding its second and what will be 3 hearings on human rights in Asia. In July, we discussed human rights in Southeast Asia. This winter, we will focus on China and East Asia. Today, we will focus on South Asia. While there are many human rights issues in South Asia, the entire world is focused on what is happening today in Kashmir. We will have 2 panels. The second panel, we will hear experts and people with real on-the-ground experience and diverse viewpoints on Kashmir and other issues in South Asia. This morning, we're pleased to have the 2 witnesses you ought to have in a hearing on human rights in South Asia. We have the Assistant Secretary for South Asia and the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights. And I should point out that the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights is making his maiden appearance as Assistant Secretary, whereas Secretary Wells has been here so often that we really ought to give her office space. Now, to put this in perspective, South Asia has more political freedom than other parts of Asia. Freedom House scores on a scale of 1 to 100. China gets an 11, India gets a 75, 56 for Sri Lanka, and 40 for Bangladesh and Pakistan. As to Sri Lanka, that country's tragic civil war ended a decade ago, but the government has yet to fulfill its commitments for justice and peace for the Tamil minority. There has been a lack of accountability for human rights violations during the civil war. After the horrific Easter Sunday terrorist attacks, Sri Lanka's Muslim community has faced a backlash. I have co-sponsored a bill introduced by our colleague, Ms. Titus, that calls on Sri Lanka not to let these attacks cause an infringement on the civil liberties or damage the reconciliation process. As to Pakistan, this afternoon we will hear particularly on the situation in Sindh, where there are enforced disappearances, attacks on religious minorities, forced conversions, and the State Department reports also mention concerns about Pakistan's blasphemy laws and the Ahmadi community. I should point out that what I think is the single greatest human rights concern in South Asia is Dr. Afridi. The man who helped us get Osama bin Laden has been imprisoned by Pakistan. I have called for even prisoner exchanges, even of convicted criminals held in the United States, whatever is necessary to free Dr. Afridi. As to India, on August 5th, the central government revoked Article 370, which gave autonomy to Kashmir. As to the legality and the history, in 1946, the British sold the Kashmir Valley to the Maharaja Gulab Singh. 3 generations later, his grandson's nephew signed an instrument for Kashmir succession to India in 1947. Now, America does not focus on the rights of imperialists and the rights of monarchs, and would have a tendency not to recognize that as being dispositive as to which government should control which territory. On the other hand, much of the world's borders reflect the actions of monarchies and imperialist and monarchical imperialists. And we would be loath to change those international borders, which raises the question, is the line of control an international border? And so the origins of the Kashmir conflict are complex. I regard this as the most dangerous geopolitical flashpoint in the world. It is, after all, the only geopolitical flashpoint that has involved wars between two nuclear powers. For years, I've strongly condemned the terrorist attacks in Kashmir and elsewhere that have arisen out of the claims of those who oppose Indian control of the Kashmir Valley. I've also spoken about the Kashmiri Pandits. This year, I introduced House Resolution 408, condemning the terrorist attacks that tragically killed 41 Indian Central Reserve Police. The Indian government's decision on August 5th regarding Article 370 and Article 35A was not a direct response to these terrorist attacks, was not cleared with the United States or anyone else, and has led to great concerns for humanitarian conditions in Kashmir. Hundreds, if not thousands, of political and civil society leaders have been detained. There are severe restrictions on the freedom of movement, freedom of the assembly, just the ability to walk out of your house. Phone and internet services were shut down after 2 months. Some have been lifted, but roughly half the cell phones in the Kashmir Valley are not operating. Of course, those are the ones without a registered owner. But for months, I was hearing from my constituents who could not get to their families and reach their families. We're still worried about medicine. We're still worried about medical appointments, et cetera. There are also limitations on journalists and outside observers. Senator Van Hollen was prohibited from going to Kashmir when he was in India. Democracy dies in the darkness. We see that at the top of the Washington Post every day. We need an impartial view of what is happening there. India's government says its restrictions will prevent protests that could turn violent, but we have to ask, when, if not now, will peaceful protests be allowed, and when will the international press be allowed to look not only at political protests, but the day-to-day lives of the people of the Kashmir Valley, children not attending school, those with medical needs unable to get to a doctor. To be sure, militants are also terrorizing the Kashmiri people and obstructing a return to normalcy. We need to focus on the human rights of the people of the Kashmir Valley today and hopefully a resolution of the dispute in the years to come. Also involving India is its new citizenship law. There appear to be 1.9 million persons from India who can't get on the national register, mostly in Assam. We'll be hearing about that from our witnesses. Another issue that affects South Asia is the plight of the Rohingya. We covered this chiefly in our hearing on Southeast Asia, since the government taking wrongful action is in Southeast Asia, Myanmar, Burma. I want to point out that the United States has been the most generous country in the world, providing, I believe the new figure is $660 million of aid to the Rohingya people. I fought for that. I know that my friend Mohammed Khan, who has worked so hard with me on fighting for that refugee aid, but we can't rest till those people can return to their homes in safety. There are labor and children's rights issues around the region. To conclude, as co-chair of the India Caucus, as chair of this subcommittee, I recognize the strategic importance and the economic importance of India and all of the countries of South Asia. That natural alliance is set back when human rights deteriorate. I look forward to learning more from our distinguished panel, and I now recognize the gentleman from Florida.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Sherman, for holding this hearing on human rights in South Asia. I'd like to welcome Ambassador Alice Wells again. You should be an honorary member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of South and Central Asia, along with Robert Destro, Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. I look forward to hearing how the State Department helps protect human rights and respond to abuses in this very important region. The security and prosperity of South Asia plays a vital role in the border Indo-Pacific strategy, or the broader Indo-Pacific strategy of the Trump administration, as well as the security of America. South Asia is home to almost 2 billion people and serves as an essential economic hub in many cross-regional shipping routes. This is a region that will continue to grow in population and development, and we must not overlook our South Asian partners. Amongst South Asian nations are India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. While we have witnessed these countries grow economically, and we're happy for that over the years, the region is still facing human rights concerns and inter-country conflicts. There has been decreased transparency and government accountability and deterioration of rights and freedoms of citizens. We have recently witnessed disputes between India and Pakistan over the territory of Jammu and Kashmir. As ranking member of this subcommittee, I have followed the situation very closely and honor the wishes of both countries and respect that, and that this issue should stay between India and Pakistan. We should be facilitating partners in any capacity that we're asked to. I also understand that the recent decision to abrogate Article 370 of the Indian Constitution is within the government of India's means and an internal issue. However, it is my hope that any restrictions on individuals and families in the region are removed as quickly as possible. We had somebody come in that was from Kashmir. She's a dentist at the University of Florida, and she was talking about her grandmother who was sick during this period of time. When all cell phones were cut down, the internet were cut down, she found out that her grandmother passed away through a third-party person in another country weeks later. And this is something that nobody should have to go through that. There have been reports of detainments and communication blockades in Kashmir over the past 2 months, which are, I would think, would be not acceptable to anybody. The government of India claims this move was made to increase economic development in Jammu and Kashmir, and I hope that the people of this region begin to feel the improvements in a timely manner without unnecessary restrictions and burdens being placed on them. We cannot put the safety and security of these individuals at risk. Again, I don't think anybody should have to live under those circumstances, and I would hope the free world would agree with that. I would also like to shed light on the human rights concerns in Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. Among these are concerns around the integrity of Bangladesh's 2018 election, during which police intimidation and suppression of the opposition occurred. Some people call this a sham election, and we're seeing too many of these in so-called Western democracies. The sham election that people are calling this brings into question the future status of democracies, not just in Bangladesh, but around the world. And this is something, again, I think we should all be concerned with, because these provide liberties and freedoms for people. While Bangladesh has faced these internal concerns, the situation on the ground has also worsened with the opening of the border to 700,000 Rohingya who are escaping persecution in neighboring Myanmar. There have been mounting tensions between the Bangladeshis and the Rohingya, which have led to violence and human rights concerns as Bangladesh becomes overburdened with refugees. This is something, again, that's going to happen over and over again if we can't help countries facilitate a peaceful resolution and a solution for these crises that we see around the world. Sri Lanka is another country where we are witnessing the dismantling of political integrity. The international community has voiced concern over Sri Lanka's upcoming presidential elections, where the front runner is an alleged war criminal and brother of Sri Lanka's former authoritarian leader. Additionally, in August, Shavendra Silva was appointed as the head of Sri Lanka's army despite allegations from the UN of being directly responsible for the atrocities in the civil war. As we continue to witness deteriorating democratic regions and values in the region, it brings into question how the United States should shape our policies for security cooperations and development assistance with these countries. And we've talked about this over and over again on this committee. Secretary Wells, you've been here, you've heard us talk about this. We need to have, from your expert opinion, and you, Mr. Destro, of what we need to do different in our approach moving forward of how we deal with countries in human rights and what better way we can do this. While I do not believe an appropriate response to these concerns should be a complete withdrawal from the region, there must be certain aspects of our relationship that are reevaluated when conditions worsen on the ground. The United States cannot afford a complete withdrawal from the strategic regions. We know those are not good techniques. Should the U.S. pull out because these countries do not hold themselves to the high standards of the United States, China will immediately fill this void, or somebody worse if that is possible. This is a move that will put the security of the Indo-Pacific and the world at risk. This is a decision the leaders of these countries have to make for the posterity of those countries, whether it's Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, India, or Pakistan, of the direction those countries are for the next generations to come and its citizens. I look forward to the hearing from the panel on how the U.S. can balance our commitment to promoting human rights with our geopolitical and strategic interests in the region. And Mr. Chairman, I have to go present a bill, and I'll be back shortly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Consistent with the traditions and rules of the committee, members of Congress who are not members of the full committee, and those who are members of the full committee but not members of the subcommittee will be allowed to participate in the appropriate order. All members here will be recognized for a minute opening statement should they wish to deliver one, and I will look down to see whether anyone wishes to make an opening statement. Does the gentlelady from Virginia wish to be recognized?
Yes, Mr. Chair.
You're recognized.
I thank the chair for hosting this hearing. I thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to asking questions. I'm here as a representative of Virginia's 7th District, and I'm here advocating on behalf of my constituents. My constituents have brought questions to me, which I hope to pass along to you. I hope this is a productive conversation, and I'm deeply concerned about what we are hearing, the allegations of what are happening in Kashmir, what's been reported in the press, and what has not been reported as openly, but the things I'm hearing from constituents, conflicting reports between what I'm hearing from the government of India and what families are telling me. It's an honor to serve the people of Central Virginia, a home to a diverse community, many of whom have friends and family back in Kashmir and throughout Asia. Mr. Chair, I yield back, and I look forward to this continued conversation.
Thank you. I know the chair of the full committee is on his way. We'll recognize him when he gets here. I will recognize the gentlelady from the state of Washington.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me to be here today as the first Indian American woman ever elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, still with parents living in India and close ties to my birth country, and a consistent defender of human rights. I felt that it was very important to be here today. I was actually in India at the time, visiting my parents at the time that this situation began, and I have made clear my concerns about the Indian government's actions around the communications blockade, detention without charges, and I've done that on social media, I've done it with the press, and I've actually spoken directly to the Indian government representatives, most recently with the Deputy Ambassador of India to the United States. And I recognize that the situation is complex. I recognize that Pakistan is not without responsibility in some of its actions. However, India, as the world's largest democracy, is a critical ally for the United States as two democratic nations, and a critical partner, and I think our mutual commitment to human rights needs to be upheld. So I look forward to asking questions, and I thank you both for appearing before us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the ranking member for allowing me to be here today.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized. Should he wish to make a statement?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, represent families who have both ties, connections, and families in Kashmir, India, and Pakistan, and it has been brought to my attention the situation that is emerging, the conditions on the ground, and I, too, have considerable concerns about the way ahead, and particularly what the role of the United States government is in addressing this situation and, in the eyes of many, this crisis. I've had an opportunity to meet with many of the families in my district who, again, have families in Kashmir, and it is a privilege to be able to sit today with this subcommittee as we hear testimony on this important matter. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. On behalf of the, do you have an opening statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing. Secretary Wells, Secretary Destro, thank you for being here. Like my colleagues, you know, we're all very concerned about the situation in Kashmir, mainly that the facts come out and then we get to the truth. That's really what our goal is here, so that we can make the decisions that we need to make on this committee. I thank the chairman for having this hearing today.
Thank you. Our first witness, as has been mentioned, has been here many times. She is Acting Assistant Secretary Alice Wells. She has served as America's ambassador to Jordan and has held key posts involving South and Central Asia and Eurasia in the United States government as a career diplomat for a long time. I recognize the Assistant Secretary.
Thank you, Chairman Sherman, and my thanks to Ranking Member Yoho for his comments, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate being invited to testify on human rights in South Asia. The President's initiative to advance a free and open Indo-Pacific rests on independent, strong, and prosperous South Asian partner nations. Our collective prosperity and success are best supported when basic human rights are assured and protected. We have frequent and frank conversations about the challenges that this entails, including support for democratic institutions, civil society, and individual liberties. I'll provide a few key examples from our region where we've seen progress and where we continue to carry the torch for human rights. India is a vibrant democracy in South Asia that enjoys a strong and growing strategic partnership with the United States. This past May, we witnessed over 600 million Indians of every caste, sect, and religious background head to the polls in a remarkable display of parliamentary democracy. As with any country, we believe it is important to discuss issues related to human rights and religious freedom with the Indian government, as well as to maintain an active dialogue with India's robust civil society. We also continue to raise international parental child abductions as an issue that remains a high priority for my Bureau and for Mission India. Let me now turn to Jammu and Kashmir, where we've been closely monitoring the situation in the aftermath of India's August 5 decision to abrogate Article 370 of its constitution. We share the concerns expressed by many members of Congress and their constituents about the manner in which Indian authorities have implemented that decision. The department has raised its concerns with the Indian government about the continued detentions of hundreds of local residents and political leaders, including 3 former chief ministers of Jammu and Kashmir. We have urged Indian authorities to restore full access to internet and mobile phone services and to hold promised assembly elections at the earliest opportunity. The United States supports the rights of Kashmiris to peacefully protest, but condemns the actions of those who seek to use violence and fear to undermine dialogue. We continue to impress upon Pakistan the need to take action against groups such as Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, which seek to foment violence across the line of control. In the 1972 Shimla Accord, India and Pakistan agreed to maintain direct bilateral dialogue. We encourage both countries to do so and to reduce tensions along the line of control, enabling people on both sides to live in peace and dignity. In Pakistan, we welcomed a second peaceful transfer of power between two civilian governments in 2018, but remain deeply concerned on restrictions on civil society, the media, and other groups expressing opposition to the government's policies, with pressures on those groups increasing over the past year. Pakistani citizens also continue to face human rights abuses and discrimination because of their faith. Pakistan's blasphemy laws have resulted in dozens of Pakistanis on death row or serving life sentences in prison, with continued discrimination against members of the Ahmadiyya Muslim community. In Bangladesh, we see a secular, developing country that prides itself on tolerance, diversity, and economic empowerment, and in this regard has the potential to serve as an example for many Muslim-majority countries around the world. Nevertheless, we remain concerned about the balance that has been struck between individual liberties and national security, which is preventing the political opposition and civil society from playing its lawful role in democracy. Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina's laudable decision in 2017 to open the country's borders to over 700,000 Rohingya refugees has come with genuine consequences for Bangladesh. Along with the UN and other international partners, we continue to assist Bangladesh to provide for the needs of refugees and members of host communities, as a safe, dignified, and voluntary return of the Rohingya to Burma must be negotiated. In Sri Lanka, we're providing assistance to support free and fair elections, including the upcoming November 16 presidential election. We welcome the resilience of Sri Lanka's democratic institutions after the December constitutional crisis, but we regret that progress on implementing transitional justice has been slow. We voiced our disappointment about the appointment of Lieutenant General Silva as Army commander, given the credible allegations of gross human rights violations and war crimes against him. Mr. Chairman, thank you and other members of this committee for your continued support of these vital efforts. Respect for human rights creates value in each individual, leading to more inclusive, stable, and prosperous societies that ultimately strengthen our ties around the world. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I welcome your questions.
I thank you for that testimony, and while I'm anxious to hear from our second Assistant Secretary, I will first recognize the chair of the full committee.
I want to welcome our witnesses, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for calling this important hearing on human rights and democratic norms in South Asia. I'd like to thank our witnesses, Ambassador Wells and Assistant Secretary Destro, for their participation today. Thank you both. Around the world, including South Asia, we're witnessing an alarming trend. Human rights are under assault. Governments are closing space for civil society, stifling media and internet freedom, censoring voices of opposition and dissent. And this really should worry all of us. American leadership can be a powerful force in the world when we're at our best. Our foreign policy is rooted in our values, values like support for human rights and human dignity, a foreign policy that projects American leadership as a force for good in the world. So as we've watched this president take U.S. foreign policy away from a focus on human rights, away from a focus on democratic principles, away from American values, we've seen the world respond in kind. Throughout this administration, my staff and I have heard far too many foreign officials express their delight that the U.S. doesn't, quote unquote, interfere in internal matters, unquote, anymore. Let me translate that from diplomatic speak into plain English. The Trump administration is giving a free pass when countries violate human rights or democratic norms. We saw this sentiment reflected in the State Department's public statements in response to India's revocation of Article 370 of its Constitution. And last year we witnessed it again when no senior State Department official dealt with Sri Lanka's constitutional crisis or the deeply problematic Bangladeshi elections. We see another example in press freedom. A free and open press is critical to any just society. It reveals the plight of the oppressed and the marginalized, and it shines a light on corruption and impunity. So when President Trump paints journalists as the enemy and denounces any story he doesn't like as fake news, he gives license to dictators and authoritarians around the world to do the same or worse. We've seen a number of dictators adopt the president's phrase of fake news to justify retaliation and imprisonment of journalists, and just last week, the Pakistani government barred the deputy director of the Committee to Protect Journalists from traveling to Pakistan to participate in a human rights conference honoring the late Uzma Jahangir. We also see women's and girls' rights hanging in the balance in Afghanistan, which I just got back from, so if I look like I'm tired, I am. Just got back a few hours ago. We see women's and girls' rights hanging in the balance in Afghanistan, with the hard-won freedoms they've gained in the last 18 years risk being ignored at the negotiation table. And we see this as over 1 million Rohingya refugees remain stranded in refugee camps in Cox's Bazar, their living conditions deteriorating and with no end in sight to their suffering. So this hearing today is critical, and there are no shortage of questions about the challenges facing us at this time. What is leading to the deterioration of democratic and human rights norms in the region? How is the absence of a clearly articulated American policy supporting human rights affecting this decline? How are the actions of regional powers like China and India impacting the situation? So I thank you all for being here to discuss these critical topics. And with that, I'll yield back to Chairman Sherman.
Thank you. It's my intention, if we can end the hearing well before noon, when I say the hearing, the first panel of the hearing, to do 2 rounds. So just because each of us has asked you one set of questions, don't take that sigh of relief. We're coming at you a second time if we have time. But we'll have you out of here by noon. We have Assistant Secretary Robert Destro, who heads the State Department's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, the bureau that is the conscience of the State Department. He was confirmed by the Senate last month to become the first confirmed permanent Assistant Secretary for Human Rights in this administration. He has a long history of human rights advocacy and work as a civil rights attorney. He has been on the faculty of Catholic University's Columbus School of Law since 1982. He has previously served a 6-year term as a commissioner on the United States Commission on Human Rights. Secretary Destro.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Yolo, Chairman Engel, and members of the committee and of the House who are attending. Thank you for offering me the opportunity today to testify on the human rights climate in South Asia. I commend the committee for its attention to this important region and deeply appreciate your invitation to testify. As the newly appointed Assistant Secretary for DRL, I hope to develop a strong partnership with the committee and its members so that we may jointly address pressing human rights problems and advance human rights around the globe. To that end, I'd offer a brief overview of recent human rights developments in South Asia and our responses to them. As a whole, the people and nations of South Africa face considerable challenges on democracy and human rights, including increased restrictions on fundamental freedoms. Our mission at the State Department is to promote respect for human rights and to support democratic values in the region. We have had some notable successes. In Sri Lanka, for instance, our programming helped civil society to engage constructively with officials and advocates advocating for their government to uphold its multilateral commitments to human rights, including those on reconciliation and transitional justice. The government has since established an Office of Missing Persons dedicated to determining the status of all missing persons in Sri Lanka. The department has also supported human rights defenders under threat in the region. While I can't discuss specific cases due to their sensitive nature in this setting, I will be happy to discuss those issues and others with you privately. With that brief overview, I'd like to transition to more detailed remarks focused on, but not limited to, those areas of interest cited in your press release of September the 30th. Let me start with India. As the State Department's point person on democracy issues, I'm pleased to point out that India's 2019 elections were the largest single democratic exercise in human history. India's performance serves as an inspiration to democracies and individuals around the world. We applaud the Indian people for turning out to vote in historic numbers and the government of India for its exceptional execution of a free and fair election on a massive scale. That said, however, we are compelled to raise several human rights issues of increasing concern precisely because those behaviors that cause them could undermine India's democratic success. In Jammu and Kashmir, we're concerned by the detention of local political leaders and activists, as well as the internet blackout. According to several reports, the government has detained thousands of individuals since August, including more than 100 mainstream politicians. We're pleased that many have since been released. Since the August 5th revocation of Articles 370 and 35A of the Indian Constitution, we have urged the Indian government to balance its security priorities with respect for human rights. We understand that curfews have been lifted in most areas, landlines restored, and a majority of detainees released. Still, internet and mobile service has remained blocked in some districts. Reports indicated that this has led to a shortage of medicines, delays in receiving health care, stalled businesses, and families being upset because of the lack of information. At least 300 people, including politicians, lawyers, and activists, remain jailed under the Public Safety Act, which allows for detention without charge for up to 2 years in matters affecting national security. In Assam, we are also concerned about the government of India's final draft of the updated National Register of Citizens, or NRC, which puts 1.9 million people in Assam at risk of becoming stateless. Although there is an appeals process, we're concerned that poor and illiterate populations who lack documentation will be at a disadvantage. We're closely following this situation and urge the government of India to take these issues into consideration. In Pakistan, we welcome Pakistani Prime Minister Khan's stated desire to combat corruption and poor government, and commend Pakistan for its progress on protecting the rights of persons with disabilities. But we note, 1 year into his administration, that human rights abuses persist in Pakistan. These include restrictions on civil society, overly strict regulations on international NGOs, severe harassment of journalists, blasphemy laws that can curtail fundamental freedoms, and overt discrimination against members of minority groups. We also welcome the January decision of the Supreme Court of Pakistan to uphold its October 18, 2018 acquittal of Asia Bibi, which enabled her release from detention in May 2019. We remain deeply troubled, however, with the dozens of Pakistanis who remain on death row or who are serving life imprisonment for blasphemy charges. We're concerned as well by restrictions on the Ahmadiyya Muslim community, who face legal restrictions such as the requirement to explicitly state that they are non-Muslim in their applications for national identity cards. Limitations on international NGOs are another concern. After a lengthy appeals process, which ended in October 2018, the Ministry of Interior issued final rejection notices to 18 international NGOs, denying their registrations and ordering them to close up shop within 60 days. The government later rejected the registrations of 21 additional international NGOs, all of which wait for appeal decisions. The ability of these organizations to continue their important work advancing human rights and humanitarian causes in Pakistan is now in serious jeopardy. The government of Pakistan has also restricted domestic NGOs from utilizing foreign funding. Our embassy in Islamabad has delivered numerous démarches and letters to the government of Pakistan calling upon it to lift these restrictions. In Sri Lanka, the United States is committed to helping Sri Lanka achieve reconciliation for all of its ethnic and religious communities in the wake of its 30-year civil war ending in 2009. We welcome Sri Lanka's renewed commitment this year in Geneva to accountability, justice, and reconciliation, and will continue to press for sustained and measurable implementation, which is critical to realizing the Sri Lankan people's desire for long-term peace and stability. Unfortunately, progress on constitutional reform, repealing and replacing the Prevention of Terrorism Act, and establishing a Truth and Reconciliation Commission has stalled, nor has any effort been made to establish a credible judicial mechanism to address accountability for atrocities. We hope to see the next government increase its focus on human rights, improve fledgling reconciliation institutions, and to implement all the mechanisms for transitional justice. We also remain deeply concerned about the appointment of Lieutenant General Shavendra Silva as Army Commander. This appointment sends a negative message that undercuts Sri Lanka's purported commitment to post-war accountability. The allegations of gross human rights violations against him, documented by the United Nations and other organizations, are serious and credible. We've made it clear to the Sri Lankan president and others Sri Lankan officials that his promotion to Army Commander will significantly curtail bilateral cooperation with the Sri Lankan Army under U.S. law, while accountability for Silva and other perpetrators could lead to easing restrictions and greater military engagement. So let me wrap up by commenting that President Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy is built on 3 pillars: security, economics, and governance. South Asia is critical to its success. The Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor contributes directly to promoting good government while bolstering security and economic productivity through advocacy for human rights. Restrictions on civil society, violent attacks on independent journalists, severe security force abuses, and persecution of minority populations are actions that erode democracy, lead to instability, and deter much-needed investment in the people of the region. The administration remains committed to partnering with South Asian nations to counter these abuses. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I look forward to working with you and to bringing attention to human rights in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you for your maiden presentation as an Assistant Secretary. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. Assistant Secretary Wells. I'm concerned about Kashmir in large part because of what I don't know. I don't see people on the ground reporting to me. Senator Van Hollen tried to go. He was barred. Our international journalists, at least those without Indian citizenship but based in India, are not able to go. And it occurred to me the people I would trust most are the people who work with you, the State Department. Do we have diplomats in the Kashmir Valley? Have we tried to send U.S. diplomats to the Kashmir Valley since August 5th?
We have attempted to send a delegation. We've not received permission. I agree with you, Congressman Sherman, that it would be better if we could report firsthand through our own engagements face-to-face.
What excuse do the Indians give? They say they want to make sure that there are no terrorists. I've heard from many of your colleagues, there are no terrorists in our embassy that are working for the U.S. State Department. Why won't India allow American diplomats into the Kashmir Valley? Do they give you a reason?
I believe that the Indians are still taking a conservative approach to opening up the valley in particular. That doesn't stop us, however, even though it's not ideal, we are able to reach out to local journalists, civil society, to contacts that we work with in the past. We have had frequent communications with Government of India officials as well as with Kashmiris and residents of Jammu and Ladakh.
Are we supposed to trust these Government of India officials when the Government of India won't let our diplomats visit?
Well, we certainly engage with the Government of India to raise concerns and to.
But that's not our best possible source for what's really going on.
No. And as I said, we engage regularly with individuals who live in the valley, work in the valley, whether they're journalists, civil society activists.
Let me go on to another question. Is Kashmir a disputed territory as to which India is required to somehow maintain the status quo? Or is the line of control in effect an international border where India has the right to treat it as it treats any other part of its country? And I refer to the part that is on the Indian side line of control.
The United States regards the line of control as the de facto line of separation between India and Pakistan and Kashmir. And as a result, we recognize the de facto administration on both sides of the line of control.
But is the part that India has been administering a part of India as to which India exercises the same sovereignty and rights as any other part of India?
We don't take a position on the type of administration that is employed by either India or Pakistan.
So, okay. Secretary Destro, I'm concerned about the Indian citizenship registry. You mentioned 1.9 million people in and around Assam. Most are presumed to be Muslims. I'm told that there is a bill pending in the Indian Parliament that says in carrying out this national registry, if you don't have documents and you're not a Muslim, well, they'll just put you on the registry anyway. But if you're a Muslim, you have to prove, now this could just be one crackpot legislator, or this could be a serious proposal. Are we genuinely concerned that India will de jure, and I also fear de facto, but de jure have a difference in its documentation requirements based on the religious confession of the person?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And there is a bill in the Indian Parliament that says that basically gives a presumption to certain groups, certain religious groups, and leaves Muslims out. So that's the fact of the bill. And the burden then rests with the person who's seeking citizenship to prove they're entitled to it. Now, as we see... So
the burden of proof is on the Muslim, and but not on anyone else.
That's right.
So, yes. Is this a serious legislative proposal, or just a crackpot idea that isn't going anywhere?
Well, my understanding is that it's a serious legislative proposal, but thankfully it's not gone through the upper house.
Have we condemned the concept of defining someone's legal rights obligations based on their religion?
Well, we're doing it right here. Thank you for the opportunity to do it.
Okay. Thank you. But I want to squeeze in one more question. Okay. Assistant Secretary, Dr. Afridi still in jail. The Pakistanis, I think, have made it pretty clear that they'll do a trade, Afridi, for Dr. Siddiqui, a person who is rightfully in American prison. But as long as Afridi remains in jail, then everywhere in the world, people have a reason to be reluctant to cooperate with the CIA. Are we seriously pursuing actions that will lead to the freedom of Dr. Afridi and his family?
Well, I want to thank Congress for demonstrating through the rescission of $33 million in assistance every year the degree to which we take Dr. Afridi's status so seriously. And we continue to advocate for his release. We see no comparison between him and other individuals who've been convicted on terrorist charges.
Well, it's not comparison. I mean, we had Soviet spies that we sent back to the Soviet Union. They were working on behalf of an evil regime. And we sometimes exchange them for people dedicated to democracy and the progress of humankind. But you don't need a prisoner exchanges don't equate. I would hope that you would pursue that, because it's a terrible irritant in our relationship and a black eye and a dishonor for America. Leave no man or woman behind is not just for the military, it's also for the CIA. With that, I recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again, Secretary Wells, Secretary Destro, for being here. And as I said in my opening remarks, our goal with this and with all issues should be to uncover the truth and find the facts. We all, and I'm specifically questioning the situation in Kashmir. We all represent amazing people back home. Many come from of Indian descent, many from Pakistani descent, who have all brought to us legitimate concerns. And I want to focus in on three areas. First being communications, second healthcare, and third diplomatic access. And I'll just present my questions and then we can kind of go from there. With regard to communications, what was the status prior to this turn of events regarding communications both within Kashmir and from Kashmir outside to outside countries and vice versa? And has that changed? And if so, has it changed back? Has it gotten any better? Are communications back up? And what, if anything, do you know about the motivations behind the disruption of the communications? Second is with regard to healthcare. Has the situation regarding healthcare in Kashmir deteriorated? Has it recovered at all? And if it did deteriorate during this turn of events, what was the cause and what was the motivation behind it? And lastly is the issue of diplomatic access, as my colleague has raised. Obviously, transparency is always the best policy, and in our effort to uncover the truth, I think we need to ask why, if, number one, is it the case that access is being denied, and if so, why is that the case?
Thank you. We're also focused on the situation, particularly in the valley where 8 million reside. The situation in Jammu and Ladakh has largely returned to normal. With regard to communications, there was open communications. People have cell phone, prepaid, postpaid. There's internet access, SMS. We've seen over the last 78 days an easing of the restrictions, but not a total lifting of the restrictions. And whether on cell phones, there are about 4 million cell phones that are now operable, but others are not. 50,000 landlines have been turned on, but that's not the majority means of communication. SMS remains restricted. Internet remains restricted. We hear from the Indian government that this is security-based, and obviously there's always a tension between how people with malified intent can misuse technology and the needs of everyday people to live their lives. And we would urge and have urged the Indian government to recognize the extreme burden that this places on average citizens and on the ability of Kashmir to function, including economically. When it comes to health, because of the disruptions in communications and the initial restrictions on movement, there were reported cases. I don't have data to provide you, but we've seen anecdotally reported in the media individuals who did not get to the hospital in time, difficulties in getting to the hospital, difficulties in being able to fulfill prescriptions, file information. And again, we've urged the Indian government to move quickly to ensure that this is no longer the case. As for your third question on diplomatic access, I totally agree that it would be much preferable if I could come to you today and say our diplomats have had candid conversations with a range of political and economic actors. I'm not able to do that, but what I can assure you is that we are reaching out and engaging a wide cross-section. We are engaging at various levels and across ministries in the Indian government to make the case for why a political roadmap, something that we all understand how India moves forward to reestablish elected, state assembly, is what we would like to see out of our, democratic friend.
Thanks for the question. These are, I don't have much information on the healthcare situation. What I can tell you, given the inability of our diplomats to get in, is that we at DRL try and get as close to the ground as we can. I've already met with some advocates from the region. I've heard the stories about the problems relatives have had, like Ms. Japal. One of the people I met with, his grandmother had got sick while they were visiting, and so these are tragic situations. But one of the good things about our excellent staff at DRL is they do try and keep their ear to the ground, and that's what we'll be doing.
Mr. Chairman, my time's expired. Are we going to be coming back around?
It's our hope to do a second round. Yes. With that, I will first I'll recognize the gentlelady from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you again to our witnesses for being here. I'm very concerned about what I'm hearing from Kashmir. I have spoken to the Indian government, who tell me that hospitals are open, food and medicine are available, there's freedom of movement across the region, and flights have restarted. They have assured me that the communications blackout is over and only a few hundred people are still detained. But I have also met with my constituents, residents of Central Virginia who have families and loved ones in Kashmir, and they have told me very different stories. They've told me of families and children who can't leave their houses, kids who can't go to school, an arthritic mother-in-law who has to go through 5 to 6 checkpoints to get to the doctor, a sister-in-law who faced life-threatening emergency and extensive blood loss and childbirth, a new wife who didn't know if she would be able to join her husband here in the United States, a fire in one home that consumed 10 because emergency services couldn't respond, a diabetic family member who can't get his insulin, and a father who died in Kashmir, and a son who was here in the States who did not immediately learn of his father's death and took days to return home after the funeral had passed. These are the stories I'm hearing from my constituents, and it's why I am deeply concerned by what you've told us here so far today, particularly about the fact that there are no U.S. diplomatic personnel in Kashmir. And so my questions for you is, how are we getting sources of information? I am a former intelligence officer. I was trained to seek objective, verifiable information that we can examine a problem and address it. But we have two conflicting accounts of what's occurring in Kashmir, and I want to find out the truth. There's limited reporting in the press, and my question to you is, how can we get to the bottom of this? And how is the State Department accepting that at this time, India, a close strategic partner for the United States on everything from trade to military cooperation, is telling us that we cannot allow U.S. diplomats to enter Kashmir? Secretary Wells, I'll start with you.
No, thank you, and I appreciate the concerns that you raise, and we've heard these directly too in our conversations with Kashmiris and people from the region. I think you can see both things can be happening simultaneously. You can be having a gradual improvement on the ground, and we have seen a gradual improvement, as some of the statistics that I conveyed suggest. But there's real hardship. You know, there's absolute real hardship, inconvenience, and when you don't have the kind of open media and open communications, it makes it harder even for the government to understand the disruptions that its policies could be causing. And
ma'am, let me ask an additional question. Among the most disturbing of the allegations that I've heard is that children as young as 10 years old have been, quote, preventatively detained under the Public Safety Act. I have young children myself. My constituents with young children share the heart-wrenching fear that exists in this idea that your child could be taken off the street because they're deemed to be a threat. What is it that we know about these circumstances? Do we have any idea how many children are being detained?
I don't have data. There have been allegations made that children have been taken into custody as part, typically, of either stone pelting demonstrations. The statistics on detentions are very ambiguous. We know that thousands of people have been detained. Most of those have been detained and released. But there is a core, larger group, hundreds of individuals who remain under detention of one form or another, whether it is the Public Safety Act or other legal mechanisms, including mainstream politicians who are, whose counsel and participation in political life, I suspect, will be part of a solution in Kashmir. When it comes to our sources, we do travel regularly to Kashmir under the normal circumstances. We have very good relationships with political figures, economic, civil society. We're able to engage those individuals, whether it was now on phone, but originally some of those individuals would fly to Delhi to file media reports, fly to Delhi to meet with us and other members of the international community. So we are tapping our sources of information as well as engaging with the government to hear what they're able to convey to us on the nature of the threat that they say they face, as well as the nature of the situation.
And Secretary Wells, in response to a question that my colleague from Pennsylvania posed, you had said that the Indian government is saying that it's security-based, the communications shut down. And so my question is, are you aware of whether or not India has shared with us any specific credible examples of threats that they have been able to thwart because of this communication shutdown or because of their preventative detentions?
I'm not going to be able to comment on that, but in general, we do have very close relations with Indian intelligence services, and we do see support. There is a militancy in Kashmir. There are terrorist groups who operate in Kashmir and who try to take advantage of political and social disaffection.
So I understand that. As a former intelligence officer, I do take security threats very seriously. Mr. Chairman, I would love if we could perhaps have a classified hearing to determine if, in fact, there are credible threats that we've been made aware of as allies and partners with India that perhaps have been the background for these breakdowns. I yield back. Thank you.
I'll take seriously that request, and I want to associate myself with your questioning. You did a great job of representing both your people who can't reach their loved ones and loved ones who can't get their medicine, et cetera. With that, we'll now recognize a member of the full committee who's not a member of the subcommittee, the gentlelady from Minnesota.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity to join your committee. I, too, associate myself with the line of questioning that my colleague from Virginia processed. Ambassador Wales, as you know, last month I led a letter to Ambassador Destro and Jones with you CC'd on it on the situation of Kashmir. Our partnership with India is strategic, but it's also based on our shared values of democracy, religious pluralism, and the respect of human rights. Under Modi and the BJP government, all of these mutual values have been threatened. And I think we have to understand the situation in Kashmir as part of an overall Hindu nationalism project of the BJP. So my first question to you is about the right of self-determination. Is the United States committed to emphasizing the centrality of Kashmir voices in determining the future of the Jammu and Kashmiri people?
I would disagree with the characterization that we don't have a values-based relationship with the government of Prime Minister Modi. And I would just underscore that Prime Minister Modi came in a consecutive term. He achieved a majority vote in a very diverse
we can agree to disagree on that. I just would like to understand if we are going to centralize the voices of the Kashmiri and
But just to provide context, I mean, the actions he took were approved in Parliament, including by members of the opposition. The Supreme Court is reviewing that decision. The High Court is reviewing habeas corpus petitions. The institutions of India's democracy are working. We absolutely believe that Kashmiri's voice needs to be heard, that in any restoration, when there is restoration of a of an assembly, when there are state assembly elections, that's the way for Kashmiris to be able to register their views, also in peaceful assembly. And so I think the concern over the restrictions on movement and what we've seen over the last 78 days is that ability to protest peacefully has been difficult for Kashmiris to exercise.
Yeah. I mean, and the part of the reason I asked and the part of the reason I emphasized the context of the larger BJP project is because I think the situation in Assam is as bad as Kashmir, if not worse. And I think in both cases, the impunity we have seen for crimes against Muslims under the BJP was warming for such worse things to come. In Assam, almost 2 million people are being asked to affirmably approve their citizenship. As my colleague and the chairman said, there have been official statements to the effect that no Buddhist, Christian, Sikh, or Jain refugees need to worry about their status. And so this is a clear anti-Muslim program. And I'm sure you've seen the same reports that the Indian government is starting to build camps in Assam, presumably to hold those who are unable to prove their citizenship. This is how the Rohingya genocide started. At what point do we no longer share values with India? Are we waiting for the Muslims in Assam to be put in those camps?
The certification of citizenship in Assam dates to a 2013 Supreme Court ruling that ordered the government to do so, to address questions of illegal immigration. The process, which continues to unfold and continues to be challenged in the court, it now has 1.9 million people who have not been certified. And that includes both Muslims and Hindus. There are 300 appeal panels that are being set up for those individuals to appeal this determination. And as my colleague stated, we're concerned that many of these individuals who may not have the wealth or the education to successfully be able to document their citizenship are vulnerable. We will continue to watch this very closely, but I would stress that the appeal process is still open. The judicial process is still working in India. And as a democracy, we respect other democracies' abilities to self-police and self-regulate. And so this process is underway. Our voices have been heard. Your voice is going to be heard. Obviously, there's international attention focused on this national citizenship registration.
Processes of legalities can take place under the justification of security and the such. The fact that there are public statements of having only Muslims prove their citizenship should be extremely alarming, and an excuse that we don't police other democracies is not one that should be acceptable to this committee or acceptable to the American people. We have to raise our voice of concern. We do that in many situations. There should not be an exception in this situation. Thank you, and I yield back.
Join with the gentlelady from Minnesota in the belief that a human rights abuse doesn't cease to be a human rights abuse just because it's done pursuant to the law or court rulings of the country committing the abuse. It's not whether it's legal under Indian law, but whether it's consistent with international human rights. With that, I will recognize the gentlelady from Washington because the gentleman from Florida has asked me to.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the ranking member as well for your opening comments and for letting me participate here. Let me start with detentions, which both of you have spoken to. The mass detentions in Jammu and Kashmir. A magistrate in India reported that at least 4,000 people were arrested and held under the Public Safety Act, which is, as we all know, a controversial law that allows authorities to imprison someone for up to 2 years without charge or trial, and that's specific to Jammu and Kashmir. A court-ordered report found that police in Jammu and Kashmir have detained 144 children, including a 9-year-old, since early August. Does the State Department, well, actually, for either of you, how credible do you find these reports?
Well, thank you for the question. It's a very important one. As we have said in the testimony before, it's hard to get accurate information. And so to the extent that we get it and can confirm it for you one way or the other, we'll get back to you on that. But I simply don't have that information today.
Well, I have a report that I would like to ask unanimous consent to submit into the record. This is an India Today article that references a report from the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, and it specifically talks about some of the numbers. But in it, it also mentions the very important fact that the High Court, in its
without objection, it will be so entered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In its judgments on these cases that were submitted under the Public Safety Act to the High Court actually slammed the Indian government for non-application of mine. That's a direct quote and it specifically said the powers of preventive detention must be confined to narrow limits. The thing that concerns me is that even in the cases where the High Court said these people should not be detained, the Indian government continued to hold many of those individuals. What have we done about that? What alarms have we raised? Because to me, the whole detention issue is of huge concern for us as a democratic ally. And remember, I was born in the world's largest democracy, and I now have the great privilege and honor of representing the world's well, I think, the most important democracy in the world. So I come at this from multiple standpoints, but this is unacceptable, the detention without charges, and even in the face of the High Court saying this is not appropriate. So what can you tell me about what we've done, and what tools are we going to use to really uplift this?
Well, in terms of well, first of all, it's a great question. It's a hard question. Because one of the problems with due process is it takes a long time. And so, we are remaining engaged with Indian civil society organizations. We have contacts with lawyers in India. And so we will be doing all we can, not only to nail down what the facts are, but actually to get access to those court opinions so that we can see what the courts have said. I think we also have to look at the high side of this. The good side is that there are, in fact, independent courts in India that are doing their jobs.
Yeah, absolutely. And Assistant Secretary, I will just say that I believe that the Indian democracy is alive and well, and I think the fact that we are questioning these things is important. Remember that India is one of the countries that has allowed the greatest religions in the world to flourish, many of them. I raised this to the Prime Minister myself 2 years ago when I met with him, and specifically said, I am deeply concerned about the religious intolerance and the ways in which the Indian democracy is being subverted, for example, through these detentions and through what you mentioned in Assam. And so I just hope we will make a very strong statement about these detentions and raise it to the highest level and use every tool that we possibly can. And I hope to do a bipartisan resolution on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let me ask specifically about one of my constituents, and Congresswoman Spanberger absolutely echoed everything that I have been hearing in my district as well. One of the individuals detained without charge is Dr. Mubin Shah, who is the uncle of my constituent in Seattle. His case was featured in a New York Times piece from August 23rd, which noted that he was arrested in the middle of the night on August 5th as one of 2,000 individuals detained without recourse. I know the Indian government is aware of his case. This is the former CEO of the Chamber of Commerce, or president of the Chamber of Commerce. His urologist, who is affiliated with Rochester General Hospital, has written a letter calling for his immediate release because of serious medical issues with his case. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to enter into the record that letter, as well as a letter from my constituent outlining his case.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Is the State Department working to actively encourage the Indian government to assist Mr. Shah and also release and address adverse health conditions of individuals in detention?
Yes, we've explicitly raised the case of Dr. Shah and share your concern over the grounds for his detention, and particularly given the health considerations at play.
And have you received a response?
We've received a response that he's receiving medications, but we've not obviously ensured that his release. And there are hundreds of other detainees, again, held under a variety of mechanisms. If you look at our annual human rights report, it discusses at some length the Public Safety Act and the other legal mechanisms that the Indian government is able to use for these detentions.
The deputy ambassador told me that he was receiving all the medical treatment he needs. That is not what his family is saying. That is not what his doctors are saying. And I remain deeply concerned. So I hope I have many more questions. I hope we have a second round that we can get to, but I thank you both for your participation.
Thank you. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the presence of the room of Mujahid Shah, who's an American citizen and whose father is a businessman without any particular involvement that I'm aware of, who has been detained, is sick, and needs surgical care. With that, at the suggestion of the gentleman from Florida, I recognize the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I thank you for allowing me to participate on this important hearing on human rights in South Asia. I associate myself with not only the questions, but the concerns raised by members on both sides of the aisle this morning, as well as in letters that I have joined along with my colleagues expressing our concerns about the human rights situation in Kashmir. I sit on the Armed Services Committee. I want to kind of shift the focus just a bit. Can you talk to us about what are the regional security consequences of the human rights situation in Kashmir? Should we be concerned that a worsening human rights situation could alienate Indian Kashmiris who may resort to violence, and that this could lead to military exchanges between India and Pakistan?
We recognize that the Indian government assesses Kashmir to be an internal problem, but obviously it's a problem that has external consequences that are meaningful, and including the deterioration in relations between India and Pakistan. And we take very seriously the escalation in rhetoric and tensions between two nuclear armed countries. President Trump has engaged both Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Khan multiple occasions, whether in meetings or phone calls, to express his concern over the tensions between the two countries and to offer his services to mediate if requested by both sides. When we stand back and we look at the broader issue of Kashmir, obviously it occurs in a context of a long history of terrorism, and terrorism that's been encouraged and fanned also by organizations that are present in Pakistan. And so as part of our diplomacy in the region, we've urged Pakistan to implement what Prime Minister Khan has said needs to occur, which is the elimination of these non-state actors and militant proxies, and to ensure that they can't reach out across border, undertake terrorist acts inside, whether it's what was the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir or India proper. But I think the more irreversible and sustainable measures that we see from Pakistan, the greater the imperative there is that a dialogue take place. And as I said in my testimony, India and Pakistan did commit under the Shimla Accord to engage bilaterally and to respect the line of control. And so we urge this constructive dialogue and urge the circumstances for constructive dialogue to occur.
Thank you. So there's been mention, discussion of the State Department's human rights report for India in today's hearing. That report draws attention to a number of concerns, including reports of arbitrary killings, enforced disappearances, and torture, government restrictions on foreign funding for some NGOs, lack of accountability for gender-based violence, and violence and discrimination based on religious affiliation, sexual orientation, and gender identity, and caste or tribe. And can you just be specific in what tools that the U.S. government is using in our wide range, our large toolbox of economic, military, information, and diplomatic tools to influence India's behavior in improving on the matters that are reported on in the human rights report? I mean, I get that, you mentioned your deference to this democratically elected government and the existence of courts and process, but can you just be specific on what tools we're using to influence India's behavior?
We have an ongoing dialogue with the Indian government on all issues related to human rights and religious freedom. We engage with civil society organizations.
Okay, so that's diplomatic. What about economic?
I think our American companies, for instance, who invest in India, provide the highest standard, a model of economic activity and corporate social responsibility. We support civil society organizations who are active in improving and lobbying for societal change and implement programs that benefit whether it's women or the economically
Are we leveraging anything?
What do you mean by leveraging?
Well, talk is important and encouraging is important, but leveraging is when you have something that somebody wants and you suggest that that other person might not get it if they don't change their behavior. Are we leveraging? And if so, what's an example of a leverage?
I think we have a wide-ranging, broad, and strategic relationship with India. We respect the fact that India continues to make progress in enhancing human rights. If we look at trafficking in persons, which is a deep issue of concern to us, we see the incremental progress being made by the institutions of India's democracy in partnership with civil society organizations. We see difficult, horrific issues, cow lynchings, for instance, being taken up in the media, decried by civil society organizations and by politicians. With all due respect, I mean, India is a country of 1.3 billion people. It has, survived, 4 external wars. It has survived the suspension of its constitution under Prime Minister Gandhi. It has survived Maoist insurgencies and insurgencies in Kashmir, and at the same time has continued to lift people out of poverty and incrementally make advances. We respect that. So that conversation with India will continue. Obviously, when we see Indian institutions, in our view, fail or respond slowly, that's something we take up. But this is not a relationship of dictation. It's a relationship of partnership.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. The witnesses are warned that we may continue till 12:30, unless they object. And members of Congress should be notified that we're taking first members of the subcommittee, then members of the full committee, and then visitors from outside. With that, at the request of the gentleman from Florida, I'll recognize the gentleman from Ohio, a former chair of this subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this important hearing. Mr. Destro, Secretary Destro, relative to Kashmir, it's my understanding that political leaders are still being detained. I think this has already been addressed somewhat, but could you discuss the scope of the problem and what the Indian government is telling you as to when these individuals might be released?
Thank you, Mr. Chabot, for the question. And you know, the problem, as we've identified earlier in the hearing, is that we're not getting really good information on the ground. So I can't really give you exact numbers, especially with respect to the higher level political and business leaders. I just don't have that information, but we'll get it back to you.
All right. Thank you very much. Secretary Wells, I've worked for many years now with Chairman Engel on a whole range of issues, and we've been working for some time now on relative to the genocide by the Burmese military against the Rohingya. About 1 million Rohingya are living in Bangladesh with very little hope of a safe or dignified or voluntary return to their homes in Rakhine State in the near future, if at all. What's the administration doing to ensure that the Rohingya have viable places to live in the intermediate term, and what can we do to ensure that their long-term needs and really their needs right now are being met?
Thank you. Bangladesh has taken on a huge responsibility, and as a poor country that's seeking to achieve lower middle-income status, to absorb 1 million refugees is an extraordinary act which we need to recognize. And so we are the largest provider of humanitarian assistance. We've provided in Bangladesh approximately $550 million to support the relief efforts. But most important is that the solution to the Rohingya crisis lies in Burma. And it lies in Burma creating the circumstances whereby the Rohingya can return and live in dignity, have economic rights, educational rights, citizenship rights. And so we have worked to sanction key members of the military, to put as much pressure as possible through our own designation and documentation of the ethnic cleansing that took place by the regime in Burma. And so, the efforts continue to see how Rohingya can return in dignity, but in the intervening period of time, we're committed to partnering with Bangladesh to assist Bangladesh in hosting them.
Thank you very much, Secretary Wells. And finally, I understand that there were attacks just last week on individuals connected to the fruit trade. Could you speak to the security situation for civilians in Kashmir?
We advise American citizens not to travel to Kashmir because of security concerns. We have seen the militants take advantage of the situation in Kashmir and to target migrant workers who are involved in the picking of apples, which is a major crop and industry in Kashmir. And so again, it's just a reminder that these are very muddied waters, and lots of militant and terrorist organizations seek to take advantage of the situation.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A number of my constituents have reached out in advance of this hearing to raise significant concerns on human rights issues regarding the population in South Asia. I'd like to start by saying I find the treatment the Rohingya have endured in Burma to be deplorable, and I'm concerned for their safety and security in Bangladesh. I know the conflict is all too real for the people of Sri Lanka, despite strides to make an end to the civil war and address systematic injustice. I applaud those who are dedicating themselves to democracy, reconciliation, and religious freedom. But I want to concentrate on recent developments in Kashmir. These have rightly been receiving a fair amount of attention, and thank you for joining us today to bring more attention to Kashmir. Some of my colleagues in the Senate were denied permission to visit Kashmir while on a recent codel to India, including my friend, Senator Chris Van Hollen. Have you communicated directly, Assistant Secretary Wells, with India about their decision to block members of Congress from traveling to Kashmir? And if so, what was their response?
Yes, we advocated for the travel of Senator Van Hollen as well as for the travel of embassy officials to Srinagar, and we are disappointed that we have not had that opportunity to go there personally.
And what was India's response that he could not get into Kashmir?
The Indian government has said this is not the right time.
Seems like the right time exactly.
I agree that it would be much more advantageous for me to be able to rely on the firsthand testimony of our diplomatic colleagues. We're in strong agreement. India's also blocked foreign journalists from traveling to Kashmir. Do you agree these actions run counter to democracy's interest in transparency and open communication? We strongly support the ability of journalists to be able to travel to Kashmir and to report firsthand. Our concern, as I mentioned earlier in the testimony, is that the absence of that testimony, for lack of a better word, from journalists makes it harder for the government itself to understand the situation and the implications of some of the restrictions that have been put on the Kashmiri people.
And then how does democratic India respond that they don't want transparency, they don't want open communication? What is their answer?
Well, I think the Indian government points with a lot of justification to there are security dimensions. They have been fighting a militancy and an externally supported militancy in terrorist movements in Kashmir. So it's not as simple. It's a complex situation. I think we all acknowledge that. But the trade-off that's being made between national security and individual liberties is one that we're not comfortable with.
Yes, we spoke to the Indian ambassador just last week, and he explained that other journalists are okay, just not Western journalists. I've got a problem with that. Assistant Secretary Destro, does the State Department believe there's been human rights abuses committed in Kashmir since August 5th?
Mr. Stone, thank you for the question. We're closely monitoring the situation. We've already expressed our concern about the lack of the ability of people to do the most basic kinds of communications with each other and with their family. The right of freedom of association is a very important one. It's enshrined in the Indian Constitution. So, too, is the right to free speech and free press. And so we've expressed our concerns about that. But as Assistant Secretary Wells has said, you know, it's a tough situation there, and all we can do is try and use every mechanism we can to find out what's going on the ground and then basically report it back to you. So thank you for your question.
The Indian government has also explained its action in Kashmir, including the communications blockade, as necessary, as you said, to protect unrest. What legal means are left, then, for Kashmiris to express dissent?
Well, I think the easiest answer to the question is to use the existing mechanisms in Indian law. I mean, India does have functioning courts. As I mentioned in a comment earlier, the problem with due process is that it takes a while, you know, but nonetheless, there are tribunals which are open and people can make their defenses when they're charged.
Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. I know a number of people are concerned with the Rohingya, and I commend to them the transcript and video of the subcommittee hearing on July 25th, which focused significantly on the Rohingya and other issues in Southeast Asia, and that is available on the committee website. It's now my pleasure to recognize the ranking member of this subcommittee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate our witnesses being here in a full audience. You can tell the importance of this topic. In my opening statement, I had mentioned Should the U.S. pull out because the countries do not hold themselves to the high standards of the United States? And that's something we've talked about before. And that's something I want to hear from you. Are our standards too high that other nations look at it and say, we can't do this? And I look at the Human Rights Council, and we understand President Trump pulled out in the summer of 2018. Like it or not, that's what's happened. But then I look at the list of people that are the top probably 10. Afghanistan, Bahrain, Bangladesh, China, Fiji, India, Iraq, Japan, Nepal, Pakistan, Philippines, and the council is Senegal. And certainly, I think I could remove Japan, but the rest of them have some form of, and I know it's going to irritate people and we're going to get calls, there's human rights abuses that aren't at the level that we would accept. I think that's fair to say. And my question to you, and I want to talk to both of you, is what do we need to change in policy, or do we need to put emphasis on different things? And then Mr. Destro, I want to come to you. In India, what religions are being treated fairly? Which ones are being treated unfairly? And then we're going to talk about Pakistan. So whoever wants to talk about what do we need to change in our policies, because what I see are countries drifting away from American leadership, and it's like, we don't want your leadership. We kind of like China's, like we see going on with Sri Lanka, that China's going to offer them a way to monitor their citizens. And this is something we're seeing repeated in Venezuela. We're seeing it repeated, obviously, in China in the Xinjiang region. And what is your opinion that we need to do differently? We'll start with you, Ms. Wells. Secretary Wells, I'm sorry.
Well, we appreciate your support for the Indo-Pacific initiative of the administration, because our view is that not that people don't want our values, don't want to achieve the kinds of standards and values that we have, but it's difficult and they need options and they need assistance. And so under the Indo-Pacific strategy, we're seeking to ensure that countries have choices when it comes to quality infrastructure, that they're able to work to maintain and getting to the system, a system that has raised hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And I think one of the best examples I can give of the attraction of our system is that, people of countries love to see American foreign direct investment because they know it doesn't come with corruption. We set the standard.
Let's hope not.
I think we need to be proud of that standard and ensure that when the countries that are faced right now with only the option of Belt and Road, with predatory loans, substandard, labor, environmental, worker rights, that they can turn and have other reasonable options. So there's a lot of work for us to do, but I think in partnership with the Congress, we're actually making progress.
Thank you. Let me go to Mr. Destro, Assistant Secretary, on the religion situation with the different sects in India. What is are they being treated fairly?
Well, as Assistant Secretary Wells pointed out, India is a country of over 1 billion people. And so it depends on where you look. And so we do know that most religious groups are treated fairly within the country, but as we now see that there's pressure from within the Indian Parliament to make special rules that basically apply only to Muslims. We're calling them out on that particular point because if only to ask them to apply their own law. India's constitution provides that it has a secular government and there's no religious test to being a citizen. We'd like to see that continue.
What about the Christians and Sikhs?
Well, once again, you have to distinguish between what's the government doing,
right,
and then what are bad actors on the ground doing.
Okay.
I mean, the general...
I want to talk about that. That's where I want to go.
Pardon?
The bad actors on the ground, because Ms. Wells brought up the non-state actors. And I think this is something all nations need to be concerned with. We cannot afford non-state actors being radical terrorists. I don't care what sect, what religion, what nationality. No country, civilized country, can tolerate that. That is a cancer and a scourge on society. And with that, we were discussing in the hearing today the human rights violations in Pakistan. Your personal take. Before I go into that, I want to ask you about JEM, because that hasn't been brought up, but I heard somebody on the panel said there's no terrorists in Kashmir, but yet I believe JEM killed 41 people. So where are these non-state actors? Where are they being harbored? Where are they coming from? What are the governments that are harboring them doing about that? And what can we do to bring that to an end?
There are three groups, terrorist groups of concern: Jaish-e-Mohammed, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Hezbollah Mujahideen, which is a local one. Obviously, two of these groups, or all three of these groups, have a presence next door, and so we have called upon, Prime Minister Khan to implement what he has discussed very openly and publicly, that the need to pull down the infrastructure that was created over the decades to support these extremist groups as a hedging function. Prime Minister Khan said the other day that any person who tries to cross the border into Kashmir is an enemy of Pakistan and an enemy of Kashmir. We'd like to see that enforced, because that's an important statement. And so we're working very closely with Pakistan as it works to implement the Financial Action Task Force obligations that it has to combat terrorism, terrorist financing, to prosecute terrorists. And we believe that those steps, if they're irreversible and sustainable, provide a context for...
All right, let me ask you this, because there's rhetoric and there's action. The rhetoric is there. Are we seeing the action?
We have seen some positive steps taken by the government.
And this should be a multinational thing. And I know India has their sovereignty, Pakistan has their sovereignty, but I see India being blamed for a lot. They're a huge country, and I think we need, I have a lot of respect for India. We've got such a large diaspora, and I think we should look at Pakistan too. Prime Minister Khan is, worrying about what's going on in Kashmir, yet they've got a lot of internal problems, and it goes back to the adage, take care of your own house before you worry about your neighbors. And I think this is something that we have to have in strong foreign policy, and it's the way we negotiate with these countries, it's the way we trade with these countries, it's our military cooperation, and it's all these things come together, but we cannot do it alone anymore. We have to have multinational consortiums where we all say this is where we stand, and if you want to trade with us, you need to come this way, and if not, go to China. Go to them, let them control your people, and you'll regret it, and your people will regret it. And I think I have one other question somewhere. How should the United States balance our commitment to promoting human rights with our strategic interests in South Asia? That's the big one.
We have to engage. It's an every day our diplomats go out and engage with civil society and encourage the kind of reform and trajectory to democratization that we all support. There are always trade-offs, but we never lose sight of our values. But let me defer to my colleague.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that I have seen in the limited time that I've been at the State Department enormous consensus within the department about the importance of American business engaging. Because American business lives by the standards we live here. We set the standards, and so I don't think we need any newer standards. I think that we just stick by the ones we have and try and get as much information that we can get on the ground to find out how we influence things.
The chairman's been very generous with this time, but if you'll allow me this, the world is at a turning point. We're seeing Western democracies being challenged in favor of another form. Western democracies empower the individual and the people, and their rights are protected by government. The other form empowers the government at the expense of the people, and I yield back.
Thank you. Well put. I know the gentlelady from Texas has been here a while, but we first go to members of the full committee, starting with the gentleman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
It's good to see you, Assistant Secretary Destro. You have an important job. I will be rooting for you and watching carefully.
And big shoes to fill, I might.
Oh, well, thank you. So let me get right into the issue of Kashmir, and I'll direct this to you to begin with. How many people are still detained in Kashmir under the Public Safety Act, which allows for detention without charge, without due process, without access to lawyers, etc.?
Well, we hear the numbers aren't clear. We've heard 300, 100, it's in the hundreds, in the low hundreds, but anywhere from 100 to 300 is what we've been hearing, but we don't have accurate figures.
And why don't we have accurate figures?
Because, as the chairman pointed out, there's not good access by our diplomats, there's not good access by journalists, and we're simply then stuck with the networks we have on the ground. And without the communications, the cell phone service, it's just tough to get information.
And under those circumstances, there is good reason to worry about abuse when prisoners are held incommunicado. We have no way of checking on stories that they're being treated well or badly. That's, in your experience, would you say, exactly the situation in which our concerns should be heightened about potential abuses?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, people need to have representation. We need to have an open system. India, says it has an open system and it has functioning courts. Our problem is that we need to make sure that people get adequate representation and get a chance to be heard.
Got it. I'm sure there's been a lot of conversation about the communications blackout, which has been partially but not fully lifted. And I'll direct this to either or both of you. In your experience, do terrorists need public cell phone networks to be able to communicate?
I'm not going to dismiss the fact that communication can be misused, but what we said earlier in the hearing is that the tension between national security and individual liberty and well-being, we think the balance is wrong in this instance. And we need to have the quick restoration of cell phone coverage and internet coverage.
Understood. My question was pointed for a reason. I mean, we as a country do have a lot of experience with counterterrorism, both at home and around the world. I can't think of too many circumstances under which, from a strictly law enforcement and counterterrorism point of view, you need to deny the entire population access to communications, given that terrorists tend to have access to technologies that enable them to get around those kinds of restrictions. In the same vein, can you think of any circumstances in our long history of combating terrorism in which it is helpful to deny access to a region to journalists or to American diplomats from a strictly counterterrorism point of view? Is that helpful?
No, we don't think it's helpful. In fact, it's actually counterproductive in our view, because you can't get accurate information about what's going on the ground. And in particular, if you deny access to local actors and local civil society, if you listen, they will tell you. Yeah. And so this is a problem.
Yeah, and in fact, again, the more such restrictions exist, I would argue that the relative ability of terrorists to communicate vis-a-vis other members of civil society who might be our allies against terrorism and extremism is actually at its highest. These kinds of situations disempower the very people who we need to be our allies against extremism and terrorism, since the extremists are used to operating in the shadows. They are conspiratorial by nature. It is ordinary civilians, ordinary people who need to be able to use the internet and cell phones and to be able to tell their stories. Final question to either of you, but perhaps I'll put you on the spot, Assistant Secretary Destro, given your expertise in religious freedom and the politics of religion. To what extent, in your judgment, is this motivated by genuine national security concerns on the part of the Indian government? Certainly in part, but to what extent is it that? And to what extent is this really politics? A desire on the part of the Modi government to stoke religious divisions, not just in Kashmir, but as we've seen in other parts of India, for political purposes?
Well, I can't speak directly to their motivation. All we can do is go by what the Indian government's doing. And so in terms of the census that they're taking, that seems like a pretty bald attempt to use religion as a lever to split the society. Now, why anybody would do that, I don't understand. I mean, if you have a big democracy, you want a nice, cohesive, loyal group of people. So the more you exclude people from the process, the more difficult your long-term prospects as a democracy are. That was what I pointed out in my opening statement. It's these kinds of things that endanger the world's largest democracy. And we thank you for the opportunity for pointing that out today.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Yeah, this may be the first time we've had a question from the most recent Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor ask the most recently confirmed. We thank you for those questions. We move on to the gentleman from Rhode Island.
I thank the chairman and thank our witnesses. I had a very disturbing meeting with constituents of mine who are from Kashmir, who are in regular contact with family members who are in Kashmir and describe horrific circumstances. So my first question is, what kind of notice did the U.S. government have with respect to this action by India in terms of revoking Article 370? Kashmir? I mean, how much notice did we have? How much preparation was done in response to that? Or how much of this was a surprise?
We were not notified or consulted.
What kind of operation do we have on the ground in terms of U.S. diplomatic personnel or other personnel to understand what's happening in Kashmir?
Typically, we cover Kashmir from our embassy in New Delhi, so officials would travel to Jammu and Kashmir. We have not been since April, and since the August 5th revocation of Article 370, we have not received permission to do so.
Which, of course, in and of itself is obviously alarming. The notion that you would cut off communications and cut off access to the media while you're engaged in some noble cause flies in the face of logic. Like, we have to presume that the reports that we're getting of gross human rights violations is a serious one, and the fact that the press is being prohibited from reporting it ought to be a concern to everyone. So what is the United States government doing to respond to this, to push back in a significant way? It is one thing to kind of hold ourselves up as great champions of human rights, but we, it seems to me, have a very significant responsibility to call the world's attention to this behavior and to condemn it in the strongest terms. And what are we doing?
We have engaged senior leaders in India. We have spoken publicly about our concerns. We're speaking publicly here in greater detail. We are in close contact with individuals in Kashmir and individuals traveling from Kashmir to New Delhi. I think gradually, as we detailed earlier in the testimony, we've seen India lift restrictions. Ultimately, India has, very strong democratic institutions, and I expect that all of the details about which we don't have information now will become public. And that will serve as a basis for what is an ongoing dialogue with our partner on respect for human rights and upholding the very high standards that are set in India's constitution.
Well, I understand that, but the notion that we continue to refer to their respect for democratic values in the face of jailing dissidents, shutting down the press, it raises very serious questions. And I think what I'm most concerned about is what is our response. But I can tell you in particular, what I have heard and has been reported to me from a number of sources is that one of the things that is being done in Kashmir are children, they're using some kind of pellet gun that is harming children and blinding them. And so they're now being able to say, oh, no one's died, there's been no fatalities, but they're maiming children, and then they're going around and picking up these children because they're blind. They know that they were at a protest or some. Are you familiar with this claim? Have you heard this before? If so, what are we doing about it?
Pellet guns were widely used, I believe, in 2017, but I'd have to clarify you in a question for the record, and resulted in significant casualties among people who are participating in demonstrations. There's been significant concern raised about the use of pellet guns in that fashion, and ultimately the government of India transitioned away from use of pellet guns.
But are you hearing that in this most recent set of activities that they're using pellet guns that are resulting in children in particular being blinded and then rounding up those children, taking them away? Families don't know where they are?
No, I've not.
Well, will you look into this? Have you, sir?
No, we're in the same information blackout as the whole State Department's in that same position. But in response to one of the points you made, is that situations like this expose where the weakness in our information gathering is. So if anything, I'm going to be going back to our staff and saying, okay, what other networks can we develop on the ground? So this is, the same thing could happen, God forbid, if there was a major disaster and the whole network went down for natural purposes.
Can I just ask one last question then? To what extent is this a result of the PJP and the RSS, in particular the RSS, this sort of ultra-nationalist, this sort of ultra-nationalist sentiment that is really driving this effort and this assault in Kashmir, and what are we doing to combat that or help them recognize that that is not an appropriate way to behave in a democracy?
The revocation of Article 370 has long been a mainstay of the BJP political platform. And so when Prime Minister Modi won a majority in this latest election, in which 67% of Indians participated, the government moved quickly and without consultation with us to implement. In doing so, they had to pass, or they passed a bill through Parliament where opposition members crossed the aisle to support the revocation. The revocation of Article 370, I think, is a little bit of a canard. I mean, it's not the revocation that we care about. It's the circumstances in which, Kashmiris can live their daily lives. We're not taking a position on Article 370. We are taking a position on whether Kashmiris can live in dignity and have a full economic and political life.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Due to the graciousness of the gentleman from California, I recognize the gentlelady from Texas.
I, too, Mr. Chairman, want to thank the gentleman from California. He's more than gracious. We are colleagues together on the European Interparliamentary Exchange, and so, Chairman Costa, let me thank you. Chairman Sherman, thank you so very much for your graciousness. I am not on this committee, and to my dismay, for the great work that you do. I want to ask pointedly to the two representatives, first of all, to the Secretary of Human Rights. Do you see this as a humanitarian crisis? I mean, we have to act when there is a crisis. Do you see this in Jammu and Kashmir as a humanitarian crisis when doctors are locked up, when people cannot have access to medical care, and the basic, if you will, tools of communication and connecting to one's loved ones is denied? Is this a humanitarian crisis?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's a... Ms. Jackson-Lee, from a 72,000-foot perspective, it's a crisis. To the individual families who are involved, it's a disaster. So, the human part of human rights sometimes gets overlooked.
Absolutely.
This is just the human part.
Absolutely. Madam Secretary, let me appreciate your comments. I think my friend from Maryland was talking about Senator Van Hollen, who should have been allowed to go into Kashmir. He's born in Karachi. I believe that when American citizens, and in this instance, a member of the United States Senate or a member of the United States Congress attempts to go into an area, I think the back of the United States needs to get a little bit stronger to be able to demand that their citizens have free movement in a democratic nation. Because my question is, have you denied any reputable member of the Indian government into the United States in your knowledge? And have you denied reporters from India into the United States in any area of the United States to your present knowledge?
No.
So my question is, what can we do more so than our disappointment? And I understand diplomacy when American citizens are denied ingress for legitimate purposes to areas that my good friend that has just described as a humanitarian crisis.
We regret that Senator Van Hollen was not able to travel to Kashmir. I'm confident that we will be able to travel to Kashmir again, and relatively soon, I would hope, given the pace of the easing of the restrictions that we're now seeing from the Indian government. We're going to continue to engage India. We're going to continue to argue that there should be a roadmap to the restoration of, of political life in Kashmir. We're going to argue that Kashmiri voices should be heard, as decisions are made about its future political makeup. And so our work is only beginning.
Let me say that I know that, and let me, as I mentioned this, indicate that I have a strong record of recognizing the two powers. I voted some years ago to allow India to use civilian nuclear power. I take no backseat to any of my engagement with those in the Southeast Asian region, particularly Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan. But in this instance, and I mentioned I don't want to leave off the table in terms of fair treatment, Christians and the Sikh community as well. We should be aware of that. But let me just say this. In this instance of a humanitarian crisis, I believe it is important for the Secretary of State. We already have seen a Kurdish crisis, genocide, because of unfortunate actions by this government. I believe this is a moment in time in history that the Secretary at this point can be engaging with the highest levels of diplomacy in India. One, recognizing it's a democratic state, but not accepting the humanitarian crisis, the lack of free flow of interest and exit, and not to utilize the constant refrain of Pakistan in reference to terrorists. Pakistan's military has lost their life in the fight against terror, and we should acknowledge that. And so I don't think you have a government in Pakistan that condones the idea of terrorism. Let us put that on the table, but not have it as a definition of the Pakistani people. So what is being done at the highest level of the State Department to engage, confront, and demand, if you will, an action that is responsible, that wants to ease the humanitarian crisis in Jammu Kashmir, and to have a free flow of discussion and a resolution of this matter at the highest level?
I mean, U.S. leaders have had high-level engagement ever since August 5th on the subject of Kashmir. You've heard President Trump speak publicly to his own desire to help mediate if the parties were to agree. And this has been a subject of conversation between the Secretary, between the President, and we continue to urge that there be a reduction in tensions between India and Pakistan. But we can't, while I share your praise for Pakistan's courage in losing over 70,000 lives, military and civilian, in the fight against those groups that were targeting the Pakistani state, we're looking for the same level of commitment in fighting militants who are targeting the Indian state, or the Afghan state. And so that dialogue, very important dialogue with Pakistan, also continues. And I think the combination of irreversible and sustainable actions by Pakistan and actions by India to return political life.
Right, my time is ended. So let me just say this. I will engage you as chair of the Pakistan caucus, but it must be a fair and balanced assessment of both countries. But right now, there's a humanitarian crisis. I'd like this government to be able to be part of the solution and not part of the problem. I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from California is recognized.
I thank the chairman of the subcommittee for bringing up, I think, what is a very important hearing this morning and this afternoon in what I think is one of the most important flashpoints that we're dealing with around the world when you look at other challenges both in Korea as well as in Venezuela, as well as, and so clearly you've acknowledged that this is a humanitarian crisis. And you've acknowledged that there have been talks at high levels that between the president, I remember the Oval Office meeting with the Prime Minister of Pakistan about him talking about engaging in some sort of a mediation. However, it's not clear that you have a plan that is focused together. I mean, there's been a ban by the Indian government in terms of access to Kashmir by one of our own colleagues and by the press. it's not clear to me, notwithstanding all the engagement you've talked about, it's 2 months now since India's unilateral action, as to what this plan is that you're pursuing and that you're bringing together.
By plan, I think with regard to India, the continued engagement with the government of India to see the lifting of the restrictions and a roadmap that the international community can understand about the return to political and economic normalcy in Kashmir. Prime Minister Modi, shortly after he revoked Article 370, made a commitment to the people that has been reaffirmed publicly by members of his cabinet that Kashmir, Jammu and Kashmir would return to being a state, would return to having assembly elections. How do you get there? And so that's a very important conversation to have. With respect to the tensions between India and Pakistan.
He's also talked about one nation and one constitution.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be in conflict.
Sir, it's going to depend upon the legislation that's pursued and adopted. Right now, we see, and we've talked about the national citizenship.
You do believe human rights are being violated today in Kashmir among the Muslims and the Sikhs, do you not?
I believe that there have been human rights violations, yes. And I believe that as a democracy, India's institutions need to function, and sometimes they function more slowly than we would like.
But these house arrests, this bringing in of additional troops into Kashmir, almost 800,000, I believe, for 8 million people. It's almost one troop for every 8 people. These house arrests. What protests has our government made to the Indian government for those actions?
As I've said, we've spoken to the Indian government, expressed our concerns. You've seen our statements made publicly. But we value very much our partnership with India and India as a like-minded.
Well, I think we value, it's the world's largest democracy. I mean, we value that partnership both with India and Pakistan, and they both have nuclear weapons. Why this is such a potential flashpoint, I think. And it's just not clear what this administration is doing about it.
Well, you've seen the president himself engage multiple times with Prime Ministers Khan and Modi. He's spoken publicly about his concern over the tensions that exist between the countries. He's offered to mediate. His officials have engaged with their counterparts. And the key to getting to a dialogue is creating an environment that allows one to take place. And that means ensuring that sustainable and irreversible steps are taken to counter militants operating from Pakistani soil, and that steps are taken by India to restore political.
So, what do you think the purpose of the military buildup is in that region?
The troop numbers that are cited are misleading in the sense that a lot of those troops, many of those troops, are deployed along the line of control. And along the line of control, there are ongoing military skirmishes. Yesterday, 10 people were killed as a result of cross-border fire. And this has been the state of the line of control since the ceasefire of 2003 broke down. We urge both parties to return to respect for the line of control, use of the DGMO hotline, and other confidence-building measures. We welcome the fact, for instance, that in November, a corridor will be opened up between India and Pakistan that will allow Sikh pilgrims to travel to holy sites in Pakistan.
I understand the gurdwaras have been closed. Is that your understanding among the Sikhs?
I'm sorry?
That their Sikh temples have been closed. Is that accurate, do you think?
The corridor that we're talking about is to allow and facilitate pilgrims, Sikh pilgrims from India to travel freely to Pakistan in order to visit a shrine.
And I've met with a number of constituents, Kashmir Americans, who are concerned about their relatives in the region and trying to contact them. And it's been noted by other members about the lack of access to cell communication and other means. What are you trying to do what advice would you give me to give these Kashmir Americans who are very concerned about their relatives?
We share the concern. Approximately 4 million cell phones have now been turned back on, along with 50,000 landlines. That's about half of the cell phones. It does not allow SMS. There's not internet coverage in the Kashmir Valley. In Jammu and Ladakh, the situation has largely returned to normal, and we're encouraging the Indian government to move quickly so that people can live a normal life and not face these terrible burdens.
My final question is, why do you think India has not allowed the establishment of the Commission of Inquiry on the High Commissioner for Human Rights to investigate any potential human rights violations that have taken place both in Indian-held and Pakistan-held Kashmir?
It's a longstanding position by India to reject the internationalization or multilateralization of Kashmir.
And what cooperation do you have or have you sought from the United Nations to, as they've noted, that this is a challenge that they are trying to focus on?
We believe that India and Pakistan need to engage bilaterally.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now go on to a second round. Since Maharaja Hari Singh signed the Articles of Accession, Kashmir has been perhaps the most dangerous flashpoint in the world. For many years, those opposed to Indian control of the Kashmir Valley have used terrorism, and yet since August 5th, there have been very limited terrorist actions, and as far as well, has there been any verified cross-border terrorism? Assistant Secretary Wells?
I'm not in a position to comment on that. You'll hear different stories from different sides, and so the Indian government has argued that they have seen preparations and actions for cross-border terrorism. I think we've observed a decline in infiltrations across the line of control, but to specific incidents, I can't comment.
Well, on the one hand, none of us can support the use of terrorism by Pakistan over the decades. On the other hand, they've been more restrained than I would have expected them to be, given the repeal of the relevant articles of the Constitution. We've got a situation for American citizens where when they try to get a visa from India, they're subject to special scrutiny and limitations, a whole different process, really, for getting a visa. If even their grandparent, perhaps even great-grandparent, had once been a citizen of Pakistan. That is a discrimination based on national origin. Is it our policy to push our friends to treat all Americans the same, regardless of race, religion, or national origin?
I can't comment on the administrative measures or security measures that...
Just as general policy, if some country in the world said, you know, Protestants have to go through, you know, everybody's can enter our country, but Protestants have to wait 6 months and we do a review. Wouldn't that clash with American values? Don't we stand up for all Americans being treated the same?
Of course, we want fair treatment for all Americans.
Have we urged the Indian government to treat all American citizens the same, even if they have a variety of different national origins?
I don't know the status of our dialogue on that.
Then let me put it this way. Given that it is our belief that all American citizens should be treated equally and not discriminated based on race or national origin, can I count on you to bring this up with the Indian government, that they should treat all Americans the same?
Yes.
Thank you. Assistant Secretary Destro, we've got elections called for the Kashmir Valley for certain local positions. It's by no means clear what authority the people elected will have, given the fact that this is being made a union territory. There are no international observers of these elections, and in fact, we're being told that it's too dangerous that for American diplomats to be able to travel to Kashmir, or for some reason American diplomats aren't being allowed to go. What credence should we give to the elections being held this month in Kashmir?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think we need to wait and see what happens. I mean, I think that we have to, because as Assistant Secretary Wells said, the Indian government has resisted the internationalization of the situation there. We simply have to see, because at least it's a start. You know, holding the elections is a start, but we'll have
we've all commented very favorably on the fact that Israel's the largest democracy, that we have faith in their electoral process in general. Can we have faith in the process of local elections in Kashmir? Secretary Wells.
The elections that are going to be held they're sub-district development council elections. So I think, it's obviously going to be one measurement to see the willingness of the Kashmiri people to engage in a process with the central government. More important is what is going to be the political status and the rights of Kashmiris down the road, and the ability to move quickly towards restoration of state status and assembly elections.
I would just point out that if President Obama had declared Texas a federal territory, or if President Trump did the same to my state of California, there would be considerable resistance in the abolition. I want to shift over to Sri Lanka. Local control over land use, the police, and education has been an issue since Sri Lankan independence. Whether those important items should be decided at a local or regional level or in a centralized government. As part of the effort to bring the society together after the Civil War, there's been considerable discussion of devolution. What can the U.S. do to advance a federalist system, a decentralized system in Sri Lanka that will make each of the and all of the communities, including the Tamil and Muslim communities, feel comfortable?
I think we've seen some positive steps by the government to achieve the Geneva Accords, whether it was it's been the return of land, setting up the Office of Reparations, the Office of Missing Persons, engaging in prosecutions. But what we haven't seen is the constitutional reform move forward. And we encourage the government of Sri Lanka, and we welcome the reaffirmation following the December constitutional crisis by the government that they still sought to adhere to the Geneva commitments that they undertook. And so we continue to urge the deliberations over constitutional reform, over the Prevention of Terrorism Act, over the establishment of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and steps, and that's why when we see steps like the appointment of General Silva as commander of the Army are concerning, because it is a step back from that, from the process to reconciliation.
Yes, and if I can also add that we have several programs in Sri Lanka where we're actually working with people on the ground. And, while the situation may not be exactly the way we want it, we simply have to accept the situation as it is and work within the parameters that we have. So we're trying to help with election support, with anti-corruption efforts, with transitional justice, and with religious freedom. We can't dictate the situation on the ground, but in the end, free and fair elections are the goal of our foreign policy, and we're going to be working hard on that.
Thank you. I will announce that our second panel will start at 2 p.m., but in room 2318, and there we will have people who have been born in Kashmir and are familiar. I'm not going to skip her. We have, as our last and best second iteration panel, the gentlelady from Washington.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I should have known you wouldn't have skipped. Prime Minister Modi promised last week to, quote, normalize the situation in Jammu and Kashmir within 4 months. Has the State Department, Secretary Wells, has the State Department made it clear what normalizing would look like for the United States? What metrics are there to normalizing? For example, normalizing would not be there unless detained people are released, communications blackout ends, the curfews are fully lifted. Has the State Department articulated those metrics to the Indian government?
While we don't speak in terms of metrics, we do raise the specific issues that you've just raised. The release of political detainees, the reestablishment of normal economic life, the roadmap towards meaningful political life, including restoration of a state assembly.
4 months, I'll tell you, sounds like a very long time for me when we're talking about things like detention and communications blockades. The Indian government has stated that its revocation of special status for Jammu and Kashmir will lead to increased economic growth for the Kashmiri people. I will tell you, it seems very difficult to see this as an economic growth move when top elected leaders, business leaders, in my case, the case with my constituent, former head of the Chamber of Commerce, and other public figures remain in detention. The internet is still cut off, and 60% of the people in the Kashmir Valley who rely on prepaid phones still cannot make calls. How is the State Department making clear the urgency? I think you're hearing that from all of the members on this committee. We are concerned about the urgency of the situation and very much respect your efforts. However, I'm just wondering what other tools can the State Department use to increase the urgency of addressing these issues?
No, those are all valid observations, and I think that the tool that we have is suasion, and hearings like this will contribute to a powerful U.S. message on the need to move towards restoration of normalcy faster.
Has the U.S. ambassador or have senior officials gone to Kashmir to see for themselves the situation on the ground since the change in status on August 5th?
Not since the change in status, because we haven't had permission, but Ambassador Destro has visited Jammu and Kashmir.
But is there an attempt to say that given the United States' special relationship with India, that our government, our ambassador, must go and visit? How urgently are we pushing having people on the ground from our, from the United States?
We're being very persistent in our requests.
Urgently or persistent?
Urgently and persistently.
Okay. Let me go to the question of religious freedom. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom identified several limitations to the right to freedom of religion, and there has been, in that report, documented violence against Hindu, Dalits, Muslims, Jains, Christians, and Sikhs. And I just want to make that point very clear, because while we have seen a tremendous amount of religious intolerance towards Muslims in particular, discrimination, when I was home in visiting my parents in August, I will tell you, I have not seen the level of fear amongst all religions, including Hindus and other religious minorities, about what is happening in India. And it pains me to say this, but there are numerous reported incidents against lower caste Hindus around cow vigilantism, lynchings around supported, proposed beef that is being kept when in fact it's not even beef, and issues that are deeply concerning. The U.S. CIRF specifically identified the RSS, the VHP, the Sangh Parivar as being responsible for this increased intolerance. In addition, the Pew Research Center analyzed 198 countries around the world on religious freedom. And again, it pains me to say that India was ranked 4th worst for religious intolerance. I don't say that with any pleasure. I have to tell you, religious tolerance in India has been a point of pride for me as somebody who was born there and was a citizen for 35 years. But I am extremely troubled by what is happening. Can you tell me how the United States, how the State Department, either of you, I would appreciate your comments on this, and particularly Secretary Destro, since these are human rights violations we're talking about, How are you elevating this question of religious intolerance? Again, I raised this directly to the Prime Minister. I asked him to speak out on these things, and I will tell you I'm disappointed that that has not happened, and in fact that the government is linked to some of these events and incidents that are happening around the country.
Well, thanks for the question. It's very important. My colleague, Ambassador Brownback, has been to India. He's actually hoping to leave for India later this week, assuming he gets his visa. But I also think
if that did not happen, we would be talking about a whole nother level of engagement between the United States and India.
Right, and so but what I do also want to point out is that a lot of this is. It's coming from the ground up. And I can tell you from my own experience, and I will be sharing that with my colleagues in the State Department, there's an excellent network of attorneys who, from different religious traditions, who will literally get on motorbikes to go help out people who get themselves...
No, I'm aware of that, but I will tell you that I met with many of those folks when I was in India, because I'm quite connected into some of those communities, and there is a tremendous amount of fear. People are afraid of even advocating. News reporters have told me their news stations are threatened with funding issues if they speak out, and so many of them are conforming. Now, these are all anecdotal. But the reason I point to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and the Pew Research Center analyses is because those are not anecdotal. Those are reports that are conducted with tremendous credibility that I hope the United States would take very, very seriously.
No, and we do take them very seriously, and we'll be continually raising them, and I might add, in addition, trying to get into those local networks so that we can validate those reports sooner rather than later.
I would just again stress, as I did in my written testimony, that the diversity of India is breathtaking, as you know better than I do, and the fact that you have the third largest Muslim population, that you have a diverse community of sects, that you have, India is the birthplace of whether it's Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, Jainism. This diversity continues. Populations aren't disappearing from India. And so again,